I love drugs. I loved them like they were almost a real person, but they took me on a journey that nearly destroyed my life.
Real life starts now.
This is Real Life Radio Show with On Lay.
I felt alone. I felt lost. I felt scared.
Real stories.
I was so desperate in living such a dark and callous life.
Real people.
I was thinking there was no purpose for my life. There's no reason for me to be here.
Real problems.
I told my dad, if you try to take these drugs, I'm going to kill you.
One solution. God.
Hope is a person, and his name is Jesus.
And now your host, On Lay.
Hi, this is Evangelist On Lay. Welcome to the Real Life Radio Show, where we're going to talk to real people who had real problems, but found answers in a real God. Today, we're going to talk about how drug addiction has a romanticism about it, where people literally fall in love with the substance that they're addicted to, almost like it's a person or a being, and that God can deliver someone from this unhealthy love affair with a substance. With us, we will have Joshua Zatkoff, who describes his drug addiction like it was a love affair that would bring him comfort from all the pain of his past. Joshua got addicted to heroin and it almost wrecked his future, but faith in God gave him the power to get true deliverance. Joshua, welcome to the show.
Hi, how you doing? Glad to be here.
Joshua, it is so good to have you on our show. And what I love about you is that you love God and you've discovered him. But I understand you had this inordinate desire for drugs that nearly destroyed your life. What kind of person were you when you were younger before you got into that? Were you like a happy child or more of a depressed child?
So when I was younger, I would say that I had a lot of anger and misunderstanding of emotions as a younger child. And so I didn't know how to manage my emotions. I was happy to a certain degree, but around 12 years old, I think I started to develop some serious depression that I didn't understand or view as depression at that time.
Wow. Now, I understand when you were younger, you were always trying to find something to do to escape from your own head, or basically the depression. And you found that in sports. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I started, playing sports like a lot of kids around the neighborhood and things like that. But I started doing leagues. I think even as young as like 5 or 6, I started playing soccer, started playing football about 8. And so growing up, that was definitely my number one escape. And that was also my first love, was playing sports. And so I played sports very competitively for most of my childhood into my early, and mid-teenage years.
So you were consumed in sports. So everything seemed to be going good in your life, but then I understand you got into drugs later. What was the first drug you were introduced to? Tell us about your first experience.
So the first drug I got introduced to was marijuana. I was 12 years old. It was around the same time that depression was really starting to hit me. Wow. And so through a mutual friend, I had access to marijuana. The first time that I tried it, it was as if it was the missing puzzle piece to all my issues. I felt like it completed me as a person. I felt like I was the best version of myself. And so I immediately fell in love with the effects of that.
Wow. I understand that this became an addiction to marijuana. Now, why would you say you got addicted, even though some groups herald that marijuana is harmless and non-addictive, despite doctors confirming that marijuana is addictive? What was your experience?
My experience was that it wasn't physically addictive, but it was extremely mentally addictive because it gave me the, results that I was looking for as far as a feeling of fulfilling me, giving me a false sense of peace, or a sense of peace at that time, actually. But I became addicted to what it was giving me and feeding me. So when I didn't have it, I felt like I was missing a part of myself.
Wow. Now, Joshua, with the marijuana, did you kind of get excited, almost like, you fell in love with it, like it was a person?
Yes, absolutely. I think that especially in the first few years, because it was giving me such a positive emotional feeling and connection to the people and things around me. I remember, like, if I knew I was about to smoke, for example, on the way to school, I would ride with this one friend and we would smoke every morning. And as soon as I would smell the blunt and the smoke, as soon as he would light it, I remember getting this, my palms sweating and kind of just this tingling feeling in myself, like this excitement, like, oh, I'm about to get high. And so it was definitely romanticized.
Wow. Now, I understand eventually the marijuana use led you to be open to using other drugs. What other drugs really caused this romanticism to happen all over again, like you experienced with marijuana?
So I had experimented with like cough syrup and, I had experimented with alcohol, and there were things that I didn't care for. But the next one that really grabbed my attention was mushrooms.
Mushrooms.
Specifically mushrooms.
What did the mushrooms do? Like, I understand it gave you some type of different understandings about your life.
Yeah, I think they opened me up to a part of myself I had never really discovered before. And it gave me a whole new worldview. It completely flipped my worldview upside down. I guess it awakened a sense of like the spiritual side of life. And so it started to stir up all these questions about reality, the spiritual world. And it started introducing me to deep thoughts that I never really had before. And so I just became intrigued with that,
Wow. So you were kind of like having these lessons through your mushroom experiences?
Yes, I think it was definitely challenging myself in the sense of how I behaved. And one, good example of that is I'd feel guilty about how I treated my parents, or I would feel guilty about what type of person I was. And so it actually caused me to want to be a better person at first. And it started making me question why I was doing things and how I could do things better. And it brought me to this answer of like, the answer to everything is love. And so that was the biggest thing it had introduced me to, was that revelation.
What you're describing, would you say that drug use was a spiritual experience?
Absolutely. Because it had given me this idea of everything being one. It made me feel like I was connected to nature. It made me feel like I was connected to everybody around me. It made me feel like there was more to myself than, just this fleshly body that I always assumed there was. I thought there was nothing more to life, but it took everything deeper. And essentially it blasted this idea that there's definitely some type of God or creator. And I felt like I was connected to whatever that was at the time that I thought.
So you were basically believing that there was some type of creator. Like at first you didn't really believe that there was a God, but then suddenly you were almost like open to connecting to something spiritual, something higher than yourself. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't know if I would say that I identified it as God at that time, but it was definitely a higher power, a source of power that was greater than myself.
Interesting. Now, I understand that these mushrooms would project you almost into this alternate reality. Describe that a little bit.
So the first thing is that you would have a very euphoric mindset. So my mind, my thinking, my mind state would become very euphoric. I would hyper focus on certain things. I would take things and dissect them deeper and deeper and deeper and go down these rabbit holes of thought. But also it introduced, visuals. Colors were heightened. All five of my senses seemed like they were, almost like spidey senses or something. I felt just more alive, and the world around me, colors were brighter, things would move, everything was just more alive.
Interesting. And I understand when you were on mushrooms, you got into almost like this new age thinking and even Buddhism. Tell us a little bit about what happened.
Yeah, so when I started doing the mushrooms, I definitely got into a mindset of everything being one, love being the ultimate truth in life and what life was about. And at 15, I encountered a book, and it was about Buddhism, and I got extremely sucked into Buddhism because it seemed to give me elaborations and explanations and tie into what I felt I was learning on the mushrooms. And so those two kind of fed off each other.
That's interesting. So there's almost like a tie. The mushrooms led to Buddhism, and there was like a cycle, right? So you would do mushrooms and contemplate about Buddhism.
Correct. And the Buddhism also, it felt like it gave me language and structure for what the mushrooms were revealing to me.
Wow. Now, let me ask you a question, because I understand that the mushrooms, these revelations per se, became very redundant and kind of boring. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so when I first started taking the mushrooms, everything was new, and I was having these revelations of myself, learning about myself, and it's hard to even put it into language, but I guess I was just understanding who I was in a lot of ways. And about, I would say, a couple years into it, I started realizing that, oh, wait, I learned this last time. Oh, wait, this was revealed to me last time. And what I started to realize was I was coming to the same realizations over and over and over. And I couldn't maintain the change that, I felt like I was being led to. And so what would happen is I would do these trips and I would be like, okay, this time I'm going to learn it. It's going to stick. And then I'm going to change and transform into this. And what would happen is I never found the power to carry out what I learned. And it never got deeper.
Wow. So it almost became like I saw this movie before.
Exactly.
Wow. Now, I understand when you were younger, you got into some trouble for marijuana use. And I understand you were looking for something to replace that marijuana use. What substance was that?
So when I was 16, I was on probation for marijuana, and at one point I was on house arrest. And during that time, I was with a friend, and we had gotten Roxicet, painkiller.
Oh.
And when I sniffed it, it was like the same thing that happened with the marijuana all over again, except it was even deeper. It was even stronger, and it pulled me in even harder.
So you felt like this is what I've been missing in my life, kind of like the marijuana. You're like, this is the meaning of life right here.
Yeah, it gave me an overwhelming feeling of love and warmth. And it was like, oh, wow, the weed was nice, but this is heaven, you know?
Oh my gosh. So you got addicted to these painkillers. Now, I understand that there was a time where you could no longer get the painkillers. What happened when you couldn't get them anymore?
So one day I had gone to go get painkillers in Washington, D.C., and the guy that we would normally get the pills from came back and said, all I can get is heroin. And at the time, we just wanted to get high. And so I said, okay.
Wow.
I saw him do it in the car. And I remember he had done it with a needle and I had just snorted it. And I remember saying, he looks like he's having a lot more better of a time than I am. So I asked him if he had another needle for me. That's what kicked it off.
Wow. Oh my gosh. So you kicked it off. Tell me that first experience with heroin. What was that like?
So the first time was, not to be too graphic, but it was an entire orgasm throughout my whole body is what it felt like.
Whoa.
The way that an orgasm might feel for a man, but it was through my whole body. Felt like my brain exploded with warmth and joy. And I just felt this almost like shock that I didn't even know this type of pleasure existed. And so it was,
Wow.
extremely addicting right off the bat. And I was completely hooked right after that.
But of course, what goes up must come down. Describe what happened when you didn't have heroin or access to it. What happened to your body and emotions during that time?
So about, I would say maybe a month this went on. And one day I couldn't get it. I had to go to work and I didn't have time to go get it before. And all of a sudden I started feeling like I was really sick. And it just started getting worse and worse. But I'm on the clock. I had a whole work shift to do. By about 10 or 11 o'clock that night, I was getting off work and I was pouring sweat. I was sniffling. I was sneezing. I felt like I could barely stand up. I had no energy. I had no idea what was going on. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me, oh no, you're in withdrawal. You're dope sick.
Oh my gosh. So you're pouring sweat. Why are you pouring sweat? Did it feel like kind of like when you have a fever?
Yes, it was like having like the worst flu I ever had, except it was worse because it was backed with a lot stronger pains and like aches, like all my muscles hurt.
Oh my gosh.
And so it was worse than any sickness I have ever had. It was definitely like a flu, but an exaggerated flu, I would say.
So it was crippling, like it cripples you to the bed, basically.
Of course, yeah.
Oh my gosh. So it's a very high up, but it's a very sharp down. And that's what makes this drug so dangerous. So basically, you're feeling like you need to have it at this point to function.
Absolutely. I did need it. And I wasn't able to go to work unless I had it. And so my whole day was planned around making sure I had this before the next day began.
Now, did you have that same feeling of love for this drug, even fantasizing about it, even though you knew that you would eventually experience the withdrawal, the sharp pain afterwards? Did you still fall in love with this drug?
Oh, absolutely. It was a completely spiritual experience for me to do it. I fantasized about getting the, dope into the needle and the whole process of putting a lighter on it and tying my arm, putting, cotton in the spoon. All this stuff was just as much a part of the high as the actual high itself. And I was in love with it, everything about it, even though I knew what it was doing to me.
Wow, Joshua. What you're describing, it's so sad because, for me, I've never done any of these things. So these don't mean anything to me, but I believe that there's someone who's listening who knows what you're talking about and needs to get that kind of freedom. I understand that heroin was so addictive that you were willing to do anything to get your hands on it. Describe why this drug drove you to start doing crimes.
Well, I think it just brought it to a level of existing, living and surviving. When you take a drug like that, it's like being wrapped up by a python. It's just sucking the life out of you. And in order to let go, you have to press the button at once. And every time you press that button, it ruins another aspect of your life. And so if I wanted to make money, if I wanted to get out of bed, I had to press that button.
Wow.
And so it's just what I had to do. I tried to feed the, addiction by having jobs, but at some point you lose the jobs and you lose the connections, you burn bridges, and you can't quite make enough money. The habit starts getting more and more expensive, and you're spending, hundreds of dollars a day to try to maintain this.
Oh, man.
I can think of one time in particular that, I was sick and I wanted to try to get something. And I tried not to get into legal trouble as far as stealing from stores or, loved ones and stuff. I tried to keep some level of integrity and stuff. But one particular time I had robbed a coworker at gunpoint to get his weed so I could, sell it or trade it for heroin. And those are things that weren't who I was, but I was doing them to get what I needed.
Wow. Now, I understand there's a moment that you overdosed on the heroin. What happened?
So I had an overdose in 2017. I actually had 5 or 6 overdoses on heroin. 2 of them I was hospitalized for.
Wow.
And the last one ended up in jail. I ended up waking up in an ambulance, and I ended up waking up and going to jail.
But you had an experience when you overdosed, something like a spiritual one. Tell us about that.
So I actually had an overdose in the woods, and in this overdose, I went out, overdosed. When I came to, it was like I was in another world. It felt more real than this world, and I was in a hallway with demons on the left side of me and demons on the right side of me, and I was confused, and I was following one, and I didn't know why. I was just looking around like, where am I? And before I knew it, we had approached this big door. And when we got to the door, the demon had his back to me and it said, "One more step, you're almost there." And then it turned around and looked at me with this big, ugly grin, this ugly looking demon. They were all laughing at me and like I was part of a joke I wasn't aware of. And when it said that, I said, "Oh, hell no." And I turned around and I woke up from the overdose in a giant pool of sweat.
Oh my gosh. So almost like a near-death experience you had. And at this point, you know you're in trouble. How did you eventually get set free from this drug addiction? I understand you had an amazing encounter with God.
Yes, 2017, October 28th, I had an overdose that landed me in jail. And I sat in the holding cell in suicide watch for 5 days, just thinking my life was over, going through withdrawals. It was probably the lowest, most agonizing time of my life. And I was crying out for Jesus. About a week later in the jail, I went to a program called the Mind Dorm, which was a Christian faith-based program inside the jail. Yeah. And in that program, I began to just really seek God. I began to read my Bible. I began to open my heart to the possibility because I was just desperate at that point. I had tried everything. And so I said, you know what? I heard a voice one day say, "Why don't you just try?" And I began to just read the Bible. I began to try to pray. It just began to increase. And it started to become real, and I started to be transformed. And next thing I knew, it was just like I was experiencing peace and joy for the first time in my life.
Wow. So basically, your encounter with Christ was very much almost like a love affair.
Yes. It was like when I started to call on the name of Jesus, I started to feel an extreme level of joy. And it reminded me of how I felt when I did the first shot of heroin or when I did, these drugs, except it felt so clean. It felt like it filled every part of my body. Like drugs always had this nasty, aftertaste to it. It didn't feel pure. It was like putting a little bit of mud in your water or something. It was at the bottom, but you could still drink the water. It was like, this was so pure. It felt like there was no shame with it. There was no downfall to it. It was just pure, and it just kept filling me. And I became obsessed. I became in love.
Joshua, that's amazing. Now, how did coming to know Christ answer your need for the heroin? Because there was a real need there with that addiction.
So I remember one day a speaker had came into the jail, and I was telling him, I said, I'm an addict. And so that makes me sin all across the board. Like I'm not struggling with just one sin. Like I don't know what to do. I can't help it. And he looked at me and he said, "You are not a slave. You're free in the name of Jesus." He said, "You're free from addiction." He just spoke it. He didn't even pray. He just spoke it. And I remember he said, "I'm going to come back next week. I want to hear the testimony." And at the time I thought, I'm in jail. How can I know? But, I would drink coffee all day in jail. And next thing I knew, the whole day had passed and I didn't have a cup of coffee. And I just kind of accepted it. And I said, wow, I'm really free. And so what happened was when I got born again, I was so aware of the fact that my sins were forgiven, that my whole life was forgiven. And I knew all things had become new. And so for me, what happened was I said, I don't have to be this person anymore. And what was missing so much from my life was purpose. And so Christ gave me not only a purpose, but he gave me a plan and he gave me the grace to carry it out. And so once I realized that all my spiritual needs were met, and not only that, but that he had healed me from so many wounds and filled all these holes I was using drugs for, I realized I had no reason to connect to this. There was no use for it in my life anymore.
Wow. Now, let me ask you a question. Since you know, how would you compare your experiences with God as a Christian versus those spiritual experiences you had with mushrooms in the past?
I would say one of the biggest things is that my experiences with walking with God brings life to the things around me, and the drugs and mushrooms only brought death. That was probably the most, black and white way I could explain it. But other than that, I would realize that everything that God was teaching me was leading to more life, and it was also accompanied with the grace to carry it out. Whereas with the mushrooms, it was showing me stuff, but then I didn't have the power to do the things it was showing me or telling me to do. And so that was one of the biggest differences.
Wow. You also said something that the mushrooms lessons were redundant. But what about being a Christian? Do you find that there's much depth in the revelations you would get from your relationship with God?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's scripture that I've had about 25 different revelations on, 2-3 line verses that have meant something different. And 4 times a year, God reveals a new layer to them. So it's always evolving.
Wow. So it's like everlasting.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Now, I understand you had a love affair with marijuana in the past. Now, how does your relationship with God compare to that?
Very much a love affair. It's very much a first love of everything else just kind of fading away. And I think when I first started to realize that God was interested in knowing me personally and he cared about things, I had this view of God as being far away. But once I understood that he was actually intricately involved in my life, everything else was like, it kind of just didn't interest me. It was like everything went away and all I wanted to do was seek him. And he just kept rewarding me and kept showing up and loving me. And I knew that there was eternal value to that. And everything else kind of took a back seat after that.
Wow. Now, how long have you been set free from the drugs of your past?
So I've been free since October 28th, 2017.
Wow. So many years at this point that you've been set free from drugs. And I understand that God has redeemed your future and your present life today. Joshua, God truly has changed your life so much. Your story inspires us to truly have that love relationship with God and that we can truly know him and be known by him. The way you describe your faith is contagious, my friend. It makes me want to go and spend time with him now. So Joshua, thanks so much for joining us. You truly have blessed us.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Hang on. Let's talk about how to know Jesus like Joshua describes right after the break. My friends, this is Evangelist Anlay, and I have a huge heart to study how Jesus is working in people's lives today and how he can change the lives of so many more. Will you partner with me to get this show on another radio station in a different state? Together, we're learning and demonstrating that Jesus is alive and touching lives everywhere. Help us to get out the good news. We're looking for monthly giving partners from $5 a month to $100 a month. Anything helps. You can learn more about this by going to awakeningthenations.com. That's awakeningthenations.com.
Real Life Radio is a ministry of Awakening the Nations, a 501c3 nonprofit organization that depends on your donations. If you would like to find out more about Awakening the Nations or make a tax-deductible donation, please visit our website at awakeningthenations.com or call us at 877-480-4477. That's awakeningthenations.com or 877-480-4477. More Real Life starts now.
Welcome back to the show. We're going to go deeper into what you just heard. So what do you think about this? Maybe you're wondering, how can someone fall in love with an inanimate object like someone falling in love with a real person? Can this really happen? Well, this happened in Joshua's life. He fell in love with the drugs, and this thing was not alive. It's an object, but it was giving him an experience that he was lacking in his life. And as I'm listening to Joshua's story, I can understand how he literally fell in love with his drugs. Because drugs, though not alive, has that draw and pull on a person's soul. Some people say that drugs is just physical, but I think there's something much deeper here. I mean, drugs, they alter our minds, right? But why do people keep coming back to this sort of thing? It seemed to me that Joshua was revealing that this was some type of counterfeit experience for something that actually exists. And getting revelations actually does exist. Christians get revelations through their relationship with God and being truly fulfilled. It doesn't make sense to some. But look at this. He was dependent on something physical. And normally to get set free from that, he would need another physical thing to replace that, right? But instead, he turned to something that you can't see with your eyes, which is an experience with Jesus Christ. You can't see that. But he was able to replace his addiction with Jesus. This should tell us all something, that Jesus is real. Jesus was able to fulfill him truly, and he could get set free from a heroin addiction. This is impossible, guys. But this brings this verse to light, and it means something totally different when I listen to Joshua's story. In John chapter 4, verses 13 through 14, Jesus says, "Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life." You see, you can't see that fountain that Joshua is drinking from right now. But obviously, something is there because you just can't quit heroin like that. That living fountain is living inside of Joshua and can live in anyone who Jesus gives that to. But you have to receive him. So Lord Jesus, I'm praying for the person who's saying, I don't have this fountain. I need this to change my life. So Lord God, we come to you, Jesus. We want to drink of the water that you have to give us. We accept that right now. Right now, we just spiritually receive this so that we can have life flowing out from us instead of always trying to get it from the outside in. We receive this right now in Jesus' mighty name. I hope you're blessed by this testimony, and I know that your life was touched.
Did you know our shows are on Spotify? Just search for Real Life Radio Show on Spotify and enjoy all the same shows you hear on the radio. That's Real Life Radio Show. See you next time.